Hi, everyone. Welcome to Key to the Pastcast, a Trumbull County Historical Society podcast on the history of our area. I am Megan Reed, director of the Trumbull County Historical Society.
And hi, everyone. My name is Ryan McLennan. I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the Trumbull County Historical Society.
But before we dive in, of course, we have to thank our sponsors for their support. This podcast is in part funded through the Community Foundation of the Mahoning Valley and also through Ohio Humanities. And we couldn't do what we do without their support. So thank you to them both.
Thank you both very much.
John Stark Edwards.
Yeah.
We're in his house.
We are, in fact.
His house is in Warren.
It is. It's been moved, but yes.
Yes, twice.
Oh, twice. I didn't know.
Moved twice. One in the 1960s, one in and we came here on Monroe Street in 1986.
Okay. Permanent resting place, question mark?
Who knows?
Right. Right.
Start the rumor mill.
Right.
Cool family. He came from quite the family.
He did.
We're going to hear more about that with our guest.
Yes.
Awesome woman.
Yes.
Super cool perspective.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Edwards. So one of my favorite things to talk about John Stark Edwards is the connections to the musical Hamilton right now. Because so many people are so excited about that musical.
Because it's contemporaneous, right?
Right. And it makes history fun. And
yeah.
People should care. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I should have said yes, but I was just shaking my head yes.
Thank you from all museum professionals out there for finding a way of making history relevant to the rest of the universe. So yeah, I think that John Stark Edwards as a whole, his house is here in Warren. It's a place that people can come and really experience what life was like when John Stark Edwards first built this house in 1807. The history of his family and how instrumental they were in the development of sort of the world as we know it today is not something that we talk about very often. So we're sitting in John Stark Edwards' house. His house is in Warren, Ohio. Definitely something that we want to dive into more.
Yes. We thought Ava would be a great speaker for this. She's sort of giving, I guess, maybe in some ways a genealogical report on the Edwards family. It's much more of a deep dive into the Edwards family and less about John Stark Edwards.
Yeah, like him in the house that we have.
Right.
So we want to spend some time in this introduction kind of introducing John Stark Edwards and his family so that when we get to Ava, you really get a sense of what is here in Warren and why John Stark Edwards' house. So, John Stark Edwards came from a very prominent New England family. Some of our listeners may be familiar with his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, who was a fire and brimstone preacher. I'm sure you are all tested on this at some point in your very formative years. Jonathan Edwards, his grandfather, was one of the founders, arguably the founder of the Great Awakening during the 1600s. Mm-hmm. And he was very influential in current Christian thought. And he was also probably more infamous for having a ton of kids. He had a ton of kids. And one of his children was Pierpont Edwards, who was the father of John Stark Edwards, who, of course, whose house we are sitting in right now. But others of his children also had extremely influential lines down the road. Probably the most infamous of which was his daughter, was Esther Edwards Burr, who was the mother of Aaron Burr. Fun connections.
Yes, very fun.
And John Stark Edwards made a name for himself too. And it's really interesting because he died so young. I really wonder sometimes what he would have done with the rest of his life if he had survived longer.
That's an interesting question. I'm always fascinated by the fact that what we do know, especially of his writings, I know we have a letter now in our collection, but a lot of his actual work as a recorder was done by his wife, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, he was voted as the first recorder of Trumbull County.
Right.
But John Stark Edwards was born in New Haven, Connecticut, to a very wealthy family. His father, Pierpont Edwards, and his mother, Frances, were extremely well educated and had many children themselves. John Stark Edwards was not their oldest child. So he wasn't inheriting the family money. But his father had invested very heavily in what we call the Connecticut Western Reserve. And we're going to dive into that in a later episode. So we're not going to go too deep into what the Connecticut Western Reserve was right now. But suffice it to say that this area of Northeast Ohio was 100% smack dab in the Connecticut Western Reserve, and Warren was the capital of Trumbull County, which encompassed that entire Western Reserve, this northeast section of Ohio here. So John Stark Edwards is given this land down here by his father, essentially as his inheritance. He says, go forth, make of it what you can.
Yep.
Here's a set of china dishes, 2 chairs. Here's a covered wagon. Take the 6-week trek down to Ohio and make of it what you will. So John Stark Edwards arrives down here in Trumbull County. His father actually pulled the slot for Mesopotamia Township. So John Stark Edwards at first settles up there, starts the first grist mill in Mespo, builds the first log cabin up there. But as we said, he was voted in as the Trumbull County recorder. He was a lawyer down here. So he very quickly realized that he wanted to move to Warren so he didn't have to travel here on horseback all the time.
Understandable, I think. Yeah.
100%. But it wasn't until he married his wife, Louisa, who was from Vermont. First cousin, second cousin? They were cousins.
They were, in fact, cousins. I think it was second.
Yeah, I think so, too. They were cousins.
Yes, we'll just say that.
They were cousins. And not very unheard of at the time.
No.
And John Stark Edwards made the return trip home to Vermont to meet her. It's actually a really funny story.
Yeah, it should be said that he was not really looking for a partner in this endeavor.
Yep.
And at the behest of his sister.
Yes, who's another famous Edwards. Henrietta, his sister, is Henrietta Whitney. She married Eli Whitney of the Cotton Gin.
Yes.
And Henrietta wrote John Stark Edwards a letter saying, you need to meet this woman, Louisa. You will love her. And I quote, guard well your heart till then. But that was in 1804. So we don't know why Edwards waited so long to meet her. Maybe he just wasn't taking a trip back. But in 1807 or late 1806, he makes a return trip home to Connecticut, Massachusetts, goes up to Vermont, meets Louisa, and bam, they're married. So they come back down here. And they actually stay with the Perkins family while this house was being built. And then once this house was completed, they moved in here and had 3 sons in a real baby 3-room house.
Yep. Small 3-room house, kitchen, bedroom,
parlor.
That was it.
Yep.
Everybody living in those 3 rooms.
Yeah. So it was the 2 of them. Edwards had an apprentice that was living here. And then, of course, their sons when they came.
So he becomes the recorder
of
Trumbull County. Or is it of Warren? It's Trumbull County, right?
Trumbull County.
Okay, so he becomes the recorder of Trumbull County. Besides that, what does he do? What do we know of what he does in his time? So he was like super civically oriented. He came from a family that really valued being a part of community, and I think it's fair to say just growing things, right? Like taking an idea and really building on it to have a real massive impact in what they're doing. I think it's safe to say that Edwards was part of not just his immediate family with his mother and father, but in terms of his aunts and uncles and his grandparents, many of them really took the reins and made a name for themselves. And when Edwards first came down here, he was very interested in doing just that. He was the very first person from this area who was elected as a state representative. But he passed away. He died before he was able to serve. So he was the first elected official, in general, that was coming from out of our area. So we know that he would have been a very prominent person down here. He also sat on the first committee to build the first bridge in Warren. So we know that he was involved in early infrastructure and developing the community here. But he was, in all of that, a lawyer. And many of his legal writings do still exist. Although I will say, and I think it's important to record this in case somebody can help us track it down. We do know that John Stark Edwards kept a diary while he was here, because there was a publication by his granddaughter, his son's daughter, that was published that indicates and it quotes
from his diary. So we know that after he passed, he had a diary that survived. However, we have tried for years to track this diary down and nobody knows where it is. So if somebody listening
knows where this is.
Yeah.
So he perishes not in the War of 1812.
No.
But on the way to?
Good question. Okay. Thank you. So John Stark Edwards, he was a part of the War of 1812. We have a letter in our collection that we actually just recently purchased on eBay. That's signed by John Stark Edwards. Good
plug for eBay.
Yeah, good plug for eBay. Oh my gosh. The bidding war for things on eBay that should just be given to like historical organizations is just so crazy. Yeah. But we do know that he was mustering an army here during the War of 1812. And it was in the winter of 1812, early in 1812, that he had reason to suspect that some property he owned up near Sandusky might be damaged because of the war. So he and a group of other gentlemen took a trip up to the Sandusky area to check on his property. And on the return trip home, he catches a kind of pneumonia. We're thinking, just based on the records, it was some kind of pneumonia. And so he and a friend of his, William Bell, are on their way home. John Stark Edwards catches pneumonia. He's dying. William Bell sees that Edwards is dying, rides hard on horseback home to get Louisa, his wife, brings Louisa to him, and by the time she gets there, he died. Kind of tragic story. Yeah. So Louisa married again very, very quickly afterwards, which was not uncommon at the time. Women, she was here by herself. All of her family was up in New England. She didn't have many other options. And not to say, I don't really know what her relationship was like with her second husband. I wish we did. Mm-hmm. But she married a man named Robert Montgomery, who was from Youngstown, and they lived in Youngstown and in Poland the rest of their lives.
So the diary could be there, perhaps.
Maybe. We've checked.
Okay.
Edwards graduated from Litchfield Law School. We've checked with them. There's a historical society there. The Connecticut Historical Society doesn't have it. The Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland doesn't have it. Who knows? It's probably in somebody's attic right now, sitting in a box.
Perhaps, probably. That's more than likely.
Eaten by mice.
Right. Yes.
Hopefully not.
Right. That's only laughter for like museum industry, I think.
I know. It's true.
For other people, they're like, why are these people giggling at like
mice eating paper? Yeah.
Do you get a sense from John Stark Edwards? Did he help construct the building that we're in today? Did he?
That's a really good question. And from everything that I've read and everything that I understand, at the time, today if we build a house, we have an architect who does the drawings, and then we have a contractor who actually builds it, right? Like two separate jobs. Yep. At the time, those were combined into one job called a master builder. So across the board, especially for projects like this, I highly doubt that there were two separate. I mean, I think we can safely say almost 100% there were not two people. It would have been one person who was looking at different housing trends at the time. They were looking at Edwards' budget, and they were putting together what they could do. We do know that this house was, let me say, John Stark Edwards' first house that's inside this house today, because the house was added on later. But the original 3-room house that they built was the first wood planked house in Warren. So in other words, it was really the first house that wasn't a log cabin. It had wood planks on it. And it had 3 rooms, which was out of the normal at the time. Most people built on a hall and parlor system. And the fact that we have 3 rooms in this house indicates that Edwards was kind of showing off a little bit, that he wanted additional space in this house for his family, that he had the money to do that.
So when he gets to Mesopotamia, I'm going back in the story here. Do we know what job he had then? Because early on, you were talking that basically Pierpont gives him the land and then a covered wagon and presumably a horse to make its way down. But that wouldn't indicate that there was money other than the land, right, that he came with. So what did he do in Mesopotamia to get to the point where he was able to build a 3-room?
Good question. Yeah. And I think the answer to that is a combination of selling land in Mesopotamia
Okay.
So he came down here with his father's land agent was also here. We should say that too.
Okay.
His name was Seth Tracy. And at the Beinecke Library, Special Collections Library at Yale, there's a huge collection of letters between Seth Tracy and Pierpont, his dad, talking about the land that they were selling down here, plotting out, like surveying out the land and selling it off for profit. So Edwards was, I think we can safely say, very involved in that. So lots of land being sold. There's lots of money to be made down here, but also through his law office, through his business. And, we don't have evidence to say that he was being supported by his family, but I don't think that that's too far off, that he was supported in some way through family money.
Do we have any records that indicate that he received visitors from his family? Did any of his brothers and sisters, anybody?
No. So his wife's cousin did come down here. Her name was Margaret Van Horn Dwight. And she wrote a book. She kept a diary of her trip here from Connecticut. And it's called A Journey to Ohio in 1810. We sell it in our gift shop. It's a really awesome read. Like, she is a snarky woman. Like, if you want some comedy from 1810 and you want to, like, really get a sense of what people thought, like, what they thought was funny. And she's, like, very brutally honest about her trip and how her feet hurt and how dirty her clothes got.
It's really good.
Yeah, it's really good.
I don't think you sold it well at the beginning where you're like, if anybody wants some comedy from 1810.
Yeah, that's true.
No, but...
Yeah, it's really a fun read. Highly recommend it.
Okay.
So yeah, we know her cousin came down, but we don't have any records that indicate that
any of the other family members came down. Ava Chamberlain recently retired from her position as Professor of Religion and Chair of the Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at Wright State University. An early American religious historian, Dr. Chamberlain's scholarly interests include the intersections of religion, gender, and law, particularly in relation to the career of colonial pastor and theologian Jonathan Edwards. She's the author of the Notorious Elizabeth Tuttle, Marriage, Murder, and Madness in the Family of Jonathan Edwards, and the editor of Miscellanies 501 to 832, Volume 18 of the works of Jonathan Edwards. She is currently editing Volume 6 of Cotton Mather's Biblia Americana, which covers Lamentations to the end of the Hebrew Bible.
We are here today with Dr. Ava Chamberlain. Ava has published a book on the grandmother of Jonathan Edwards.
Hi, Ava. How are you?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here and, to learn that John Stark Edwards, the fellow Ohio resident.
Absolutely. We're sitting in John Stark Edwards' house right now, who was, of course, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. And we're super excited today to really dive into his family and some of his maybe more infamous family.
Okay. I'm happy to help.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
All right. So can you tell us, let's start by talking about Jonathan Edwards, John Stark Edwards' grandfather. Who was he? What was his significance and his legacy?
Well, Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703. He was born in East Windsor, Connecticut. His father was a minister there. He was born into a ministerial family. He was the only son of 11 children, so you can imagine what that was like. And he of course trained for the ministry because that's what his father had wanted him to follow in his footsteps. So when he was just a boy, which was common then, he attended what is now called Yale College. And that's where he trained for the ministry. And then once he finished with his education, he moved to Northampton, Massachusetts. In 1726, he moved there to become the assistant pastor of the church there. This was the time in New England during the colonial period when, the colonists were adhered to a very strict form of Calvinist Christianity. Often they're called Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a Puritan minister, and he got married, and just like his own family, he had 11 children with his wife, and a very large family. And he thought of himself as just fulfilling this role, crucial neighborhood community role as the pastor of the Northampton Church. But he emerged as a more important figure when during a period called the Great Awakening, which was a period, the earliest period of widespread evangelical revivals in the Anglo-American world. And so these revivals swept through New England, and he emerges as a very powerful and effective preacher. Most probably well known for his famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And as that title suggests, it was a sermon trying to convince the congregation that they were sinful and that they needed to be born again, accept Jesus Christ as their Savior. That was really the centerpiece of the evangelical revivals going on at the time. And so he becomes this very famous preacher, but he's not just a preacher, he also becomes very famous for his writings. The revivals were very controversial, and he wrote a series of treatises designed to defend this new style of Protestant Christianity that we now today call evangelicalism. And they were very important in this whole period of the Great Awakening. But that's not his only claim to fame. He moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, becomes the pastor of the church there after his congregation in Northampton, for a lot of technical theological reasons, they get upset with him and they kind of fire him. They dismiss him as the pastor there. And he takes a job as a pastor at this Native American mission in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he is the pastor for a congregation of Christian Indians that had been ministered to there for some time. And it's there that he not only serves as pastor to the Native Americans, but also begins to write even more elaborate treatises that defend the central doctrines of Calvinism, like freedom of the will and original sin. And these are big, very dense books that also raised his profile, raised his reputation as not just a preacher, but now as this very important theologian. And with those treatises, he gets invited to become president of what we now today, it was called the College of New Jersey at the time, but we call that Princeton College, Princeton University today. And it was a ministerial training school back then. And he is invited to become president of Princeton, and he moves there. And very tragically, soon after he moves there is a smallpox epidemic, and he is a man of not just of faith, but also of science. And it was well proven, fairly well established at the time, that vaccines could protect people from smallpox. But they were using live virus vaccines. We know all about this now. Some people were a little afraid to take the vaccine, and Edwards tried to be a role model. He took this vaccine, and he didn't die of the vaccine itself, but the live virus vaccine, you contract a very small, mild case of smallpox. And this small case of smallpox that he contracted morphed into a much more important, serious illness, not smallpox, but he got an infection, and he died not long after moving to Princeton in 1758. So he was about 55, 56 years old when he died, and he is well known today because of these very very brilliant treatises that he wrote defending evangelicalism, and also sort of using the modern philosophical knowledge to defend Calvinism at the time. He's known today as kind of the father of modern evangelicalism, is still read and studied in universities today. And he has acquired a reputation as probably one of the most important religious figures in the country, in American history. And he there's others, of course, who are equally as prominent and as important in the 19th century, like Charles Grandison Finney, in the 20th century, like Billy Graham. He has acquired a kind image as he died too soon to be involved in the revolution, so you can't associate him as a founding father. But certainly, some people call him, there's America's theologian, or something along those lines, because of his stature. And I guess the other reason he has this position is because in the 19th and 20th centuries, evangelicalism really emerges as the dominant form of Protestant Christianity in the United States. And so he is looked at as the founder, as one of the founders of that tradition, and in that sense, elevated. That really makes him a very important figure in American religious history, because evangelicalism is, even today, is still so much of a powerful force in the United States.
So I'm going to switch gears a bit here. This is more of a subject on what you actually do research on, which is on Elizabeth Tuttle. So can you talk a little bit about who Elizabeth Tuttle is to Jonathan Edwards and her legacy, her relationship with Jonathan?
Sure. I wrote a book called The Notorious Elizabeth Tuttle, Marriage, Murder, and Madness in the Family of Jonathan Edwards. And, the very first line of that book is the question you just asked me. Who was Elizabeth Tuttle? And
I knew I got that question from somewhere. I'm kidding.
Yeah, that's the very first line of the book. Right. And it's really the central question I try to answer in the book. And you think, well, why is that a hard question to answer? And it's a hard question to answer because of the way Elizabeth Tuttle has been portrayed in biographical literature about Jonathan Edwards. The easiest answer to that question is that Elizabeth Tuttle was Jonathan Edwards' paternal grandmother. So she was born in New Haven in 1645. Her parents had immigrated from England in the Puritan wave of migration, and they had first, landed in the Massachusetts coast, and then her parents decided that their prospects would be better if they moved to the new colony of New Haven, which is now, of course, part of Connecticut. And they were a very prominent family. Her father was a proprietor of the New Haven colony, had a very large, successful, extended family, and she was their seventh child. Puritans had big families. If the woman lived throughout her pregnancies, they had large families, and she was the seventh child. And when she was in her early 20s, which was about normal for the time, she married a man named Richard Edwards. Now, Richard Edwards has a slightly different profile from her. His father had also immigrated from England, but under much different circumstances. His father, William Edwards, had immigrated from England with his father, who was fleeing debt. He got himself into business trouble. He was a barrel maker, a cooper, and he got it over his head underwater in terms of his financial obligations, and was about to be thrown in debtor's prison. And so he decided it was a good time to immigrate. They were, of course, religious too, so it wasn't that they were not Puritans, but they were. But they also had strong financial reasons to get out of London, which is where they immigrated from. And so Richard Edwards was born in Hartford, and his father was a cooper, and he trained as a cooper, a barrel maker. They were modest means, people of modest means. And he and Elizabeth Tuttle got married in 1667. And they had 6 children before the marriage went sour. Now, that's the sort of easy answer to the question, who was Elizabeth Tuttle? She was Jonathan Edwards' paternal grandmother. Richard and Elizabeth Tuttle had a son named Timothy Edwards, Timothy Edwards had one son, Jonathan Edwards, and so Jonathan Edwards, and then Jonathan Edwards had 3 sons, Jonathan Jr., Pierpont, and Tim. And then you get the next generation where you've got your descendant, John Stark Edwards. Jonathan Edwards' daughter, Esther,
was, married.
Married
there we go.
Edinburgh Sr., who was at the time president of Princeton. She also, and Aaron Burr dies. That's the senior, the older man. He dies. That's when Jonathan Edwards becomes president of Princeton. Then there's the smallpox epidemic, and Esther Edwards Burr also dies at the same time as her father, within a month or two of her father, which means that all of her, and then Sarah Edwards, Jonathan Edwards' wife, also dies about a year later, and the kids all go to live with Timothy Edwards, including Aaron Burr, who is the son of Esther Edwards Burr and Aaron Burr. They all go to live with Timothy because he is the oldest son of the family at that point.
So let's dive into that a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about Elizabeth Tuttle's life. What made her have that kind of reputation, and what exactly did you find?
These are the big thing, which genealogists found a little scandalous, was that after about 20 years of marriage, Elizabeth Tuttle and Richard Edwards got a divorce.
At that time, goodness.
Well, actually, and that's really interesting because the Puritans, I know, their reputation is for being so straight-laced, but actually the Puritans' colonies were the only colonies in America, in the British colonies, that allowed divorce. The Puritans, it was a reform that the Puritans instituted because they believed that that marriage was not a sacrament, but a civil contract between, a man and a woman. And if it's a civil contract, then it can be violated. And they objected to people being forced to remain in marriages that were miserable. And, if people were unfaithful or violent or that sort of thing, the church forced them to remain married. They thought that was a problem. Families, it was important to have stable families. And if you have families that were unhappy or in some way chaotic, then that was bad for the community. And so the Puritans in New England, they had the most liberal divorce laws probably in the Western world at that time in the 18th century and 17th century, which is really interesting. But still, it's a little stain on their background. And the question is, why did they get divorced? And in the genealogies given in all of Edwards' biographies, of course, Elizabeth is blamed for the divorce, right? And she is described as having been, sleeping around, unfaithful to her husband, threatening violence, and sort of being unstable, crazy in her behavior. And so I started, I really started there because I wanted to see, what really happened on this divorce. Most of us know, even if we've not been through a divorce, we know that usually things are a little more complicated than the simple story of one person's guilty and one person's completely innocent. Things are usually kind of messy in bad marriages. And that's what I found with Elizabeth Tuttle and Richard Edwards, was that things were not as clear-cut as they had been portrayed. In fact, they were quite different. But the problem is that the only real account of this divorce that we have remaining is Richard Edwards' divorce petitions, which are quite lengthy. He wrote these long petitions to the court, requesting a divorce and justifying why he should be given one. And he makes all kinds of accusations against his wife in these divorce petitions. And so I started digging around, like that she had been unfaithful to him, right? And I started digging around, and the only evidence in the court records that I could find of any sexual misconduct in this marriage. And again, the Puritans, if you were caught committing adultery, then it was a crime and you would be taken to court. And the only evidence that there had been any sexual infidelity was on Richard's side. I found a court record where he had been accused of having a relationship with a woman, not his wife. That was like, wait, I thought this was his accusation against his wife. Now I find out that he actually was the one having the affair. Couldn't find any evidence that she had been charged with having an affair. And in fact, the woman he's charged with having the affair with is the woman he marries as soon as his divorce is final. pretty typical. She's younger than she's from an elite family, much more prominent than him. And just that was interesting, right? And I couldn't find any evidence that Elizabeth had misbehaved, except for the accusations that Richard made against her. And then I started digging around more. I mean, because Elizabeth's family was there were many traumas in her family, much more so than in a normal Puritan family. And this might have been a lot of the reason why the marriage fell apart. I mean, to begin with, Richard and Elizabeth was a bit of a shotgun marriage. This was not uncommon for Puritans. Again, I know that's not their reputation, but there's clear evidence in the court records that Elizabeth was pregnant when they got married. And this happened back then. You know, it was called bridal pregnancy. And, you know, the Puritans, they cared a little bit about it, but it wasn't the scarlet letter situation that you imagine. Typically, what happened in that situation was that they were charged with the technical crime. It was called fornication before marriage. And then they come in and they confess to that, and they pay a little fine, and they get married, and that would be the end of it. This is what happened to Richard and Elizabeth.
That's pretty simple, straightforward.
Right.
Yeah. They were charged with fornication before marriage, and they confessed in court. Yep. They actually said in the court record, yeah, you know, there was that time when we were in the barn. And yeah. And there was that other time, you know. And so they were charged with fornication before marriage, and then they were fined, and they paid their fine, and they got married, and she had a baby a few months later. And it seemed, you know, in the court, and when you read the court records, this happens with pretty much frequency. Mm-hmm. Puritans were maybe not as pure as their reputation suggests. But the problem here was that Richard, the first problem in their marriage was that Richard suspected that this baby wasn't his, even though he confessed to having slept with his wife before marriage on a couple of occasions. For some reason, he was suspicious of her, and he refused to raise the child. And her family took this baby in. And you can imagine that was a very traumatic way to begin this marriage.
Not after a great start.
Not after a great. And it looks like they kind of settle down. They start having children. He has his business as a cooper, and they just seem like everything is going fine. You know, as well, you know, they're just getting on with their lives. But then some much larger tragedies happen. And this is where her reputation as being crazy comes from, was that there are 2 murders among her siblings, gruesome murders. Her brother kills his sister with an axe, whacks her in the head.
Oh my goodness.
He's a single man, and he is staying in the home with his sister and her husband and children. And the husband is out for the night doing a night watch, and they get into an argument of some kind, and he kills her. And he is tried and hung for his crime.
Oh, wow.
And this is, I mean, that's a huge family trauma.
I would say so.
Yeah, that's a huge trauma. And it starts to, you know, there's this little bit of evidence that I can find that maybe Richard and Elizabeth's marriage starts to get a little shaky at that point. She may be having some difficulty dealing with this tragedy. And then right around the time he begins suing for divorce, there's another murder. Her sister kills her teenage son with an axe.
Lots of axe killings. Why axes?
Well, that was probably the most handy weapon. Everybody had an axe.
Makes sense, yeah.
You know, people had guns back then, but that was not the weapon of choice. You know, there's a big axe in the front of every fireplace, in a community, you know, in every house, in every fireplace, and people were very skilled at wielding axes. They had to cut a lot of wood, men and women. It's clear that this sister was suffering from a mental illness.
Did the sister kill her own son, or she killed?
Yes, her
own son.
Her own son. And you know, there's records. I you know read got the records of both of these murder trials, and it's clear from the evidence that she was having she was having some issues, we'll say, and and in many ways I talked with people who had studied family murders like this. You know, you read about them from time to time, where a woman kills her children, or a man kills his children. They're called familicides, and it's usually a sign that the person is suffering from some kind of psychosis, and they believe that their children are in danger or dangerous or something. Anyway, the testimonies surrounding her case make it very clear that she was suffering from some kind of mental illness. Mm-hmm. And she actually ultimately is successful in making a charge of an insanity defense. She is not hung for her crime, but she is confined because of the belief that she's dangerous, right? There's some reason there that she is hung for her. She's not hung for her crime, unlike her brother, but that she is insane. But there's no evidence that her brother is insane. That murder is a simple, straightforward man pissed off with his sister murder.
That's interesting.
But this second murder with the sister who is declared non compos mentis, that happens at almost the same time as Richard Edwards starting to sue for divorce and having an affair. And it looks, from my best speculation is that this marriage that had started in a very rocky way had just collapsed under the weight of these tragedies and these crises that happened in the Tuttle family. Mm-hmm. I mean, these two murders and murder trials and insanity charges and axe murders and so forth. It was too much for Elizabeth. She starts withdrawing. There's some evidence that she withdraws from the marriage. He finds a younger woman, and the prospects look a little greener, and he decides to sue for divorce. The court does not grant him a divorce right away. He has to petition several times, which undoubtedly is because he himself was guilty of adultery. And I think that the murder just finally is the thing that convinces the court to grant his divorce. After that, we don't know what happens to Elizabeth Tuttle. He marries this young woman, and they have a whole new family, and he becomes a prominent person. His social status is elevated, and he kind of starts over again with this new family. Now, but that family is not the family that is, Timothy Edwards is not their child. Timothy Edwards is the only son of Elizabeth and Richard. And so he lives through this whole divorce. Timothy Edwards is in many ways a child of divorce. And then his son, Jonathan, grew up with this legacy. Biographers, either they didn't bother to dig up all that material because it's tough to find all that material that I spent years digging up, or it was more convenient for them to portray the divorce in a very simple way, which is that Elizabeth was crazy and promiscuous, and Richard was the long-suffering spouse who put up with his wife's craziness until he just couldn't take it anymore, and he was forced to sue for divorce. That's the way it has been presented, but that's not exactly what the evidence suggests. And so in a lot of ways, this book is an exercise on my part in gender studies. How are women portrayed historically? Are the stereotypes that are attributed to women of the past, can we trust them? Mm-hmm. Women are typically portrayed as either, paragons of virtue or just the opposite. How do we recover the reputations? How do we recover the identities of women of the past? This was the larger historical project. I just want to say, because Elizabeth Tuttle left no records behind.
Sure.
I didn't find her secret cache of letters that, revealed the truth of the situation. I had to piece together as best I could what the court records showed.
So after doing some research on Elizabeth Tuttle and the Edwards family, it turns out that Clarence Darrow was quite interested in Elizabeth Tuttle. What was Darrow's interest and research in the Tuttle family, and was he similarly interested in the Edwards family?
Okay, so Clarence Darrow plays a little part in Elizabeth Tuttle. He brings her up in one of his writings, and why does he even care? Why does he even know about Elizabeth Tuttle? I mean, that's just crazy, right? But this is a whole another part of Elizabeth Tuttle's story that I had no idea about when I started this project. I had some small knowledge of the fact that Elizabeth Tuttle, that the Edwards family had played a role in the late 19th century in the period of the eugenics movement, late 19th and earliest 20th centuries, up through the Second World War. This whole movement called the eugenics movement, in which these theorists, made these very convoluted arguments proposing that humans should be treated in the same way as animals. That is, you breed animals to produce certain traits, and you should breed humans in the same way for positive traits. And you should prevent humans who have negative traits from reproducing. And there were all sorts of, injustices committed in the name of eugenics, in particular things like sterilization of women who gave birth out of wedlock, or who were poor, or who were of immigrant families or minority families. People were sterilized involuntarily or sterilized without knowing about it. And there's a whole lot of quasi-pseudo-scientific literature that is written during this period advancing this cause of eugenics. Now, what does this have to do with Elizabeth Tuttle? Well, what I discovered is that these eugenics proponents use genealogies of colonial families, which, as in their arguments, and these colonial families, these old colonial families, and this is the same period that historical societies are being founded, and the whole enterprise of genealogy is being invented. People are becoming very interested in their colonial American past, and genealogies of great colonial families are being written at this time. And historical societies are being founded to preserve genealogical records and this sort of thing. And these eugenicists lift up the yeoman stock of colonial New England as the paradigm of the eugenically pure family. This is what we should aim to be as a country. Of course, you can see the racism and the anti-immigrant sentiments already expressed in that. But one of the families that they focus on most prominently is the Edwards family. And the Edwards family, it appears throughout eugenics literature, which I kept finding. I was just like flabbergasted. These little genealogical trees of the Edwards family, and they start with Jonathan and Sarah, and they show how many great descendants they had and how prominent they were, and how many accomplishments they had, that they were college presidents and that they were statesmen, and that, they did all these important things. And this proves that if you've got this genealogically pure stock of, like the Jonathan and Sarah, that their children will be, will inherit these pure genes, and they will be, their genes will be passed down to their children, and there'll be successful genes, and they will be prominent and wealthy and contribute to the society. But what happens is that there's two complications of that story. And one of them is your friend Pierpont Edwards, and the other one is Aaron Burr. Well, that's one complication. Aaron Burr and Pierpont Edwards, as you probably know, their reputations are a little unsavory, even though they were both very prominent men, participants in the founding of the country and in the establishment of the government, the Revolutionary War. They were both scandalous in their reputations for being a little too fond of the women, right? It's pretty strong evidence of they're having children out of wedlock and this sort of thing. And so, it was, if the Edwards family is such a pure genetically pure bloodline, the eugenicists would call it good blood. How did they produce Aaron Burr, who shoots Alexander Hamilton, for heaven's sakes, right? How did they produce Pierpont Edwards, who was, a little fast and loose in his sexual habits? And they start looking around and they say, well,
that was well done dancing around that issue, Ava, I will say. Yeah, that was good.
They dig around and they say, look at Elizabeth Tuttle. Oh my, here's where that gene comes from. She was promiscuous, and she had crazy brothers and sister. And they were violent and they were promiscuous. And this explains, this is some kind of like hidden gene that came out in Aaron Burr and Pierpont Edwards. And so this doesn't really, this helps explain away this anomaly in the genetic inheritance of Jonathan and Sarah. And other eugenicists point to Elizabeth in another way and say, she was crazy, but genius and madness are very close together. And so Elizabeth Tuttle is not only the source of the madness in the Edwards family, but also the genius in the Edwards family. Yeah, and so they try to prove that by showing that none of the descendants of Richard Edwards with his second wife amounted to anything, right? But the children of Richard and Elizabeth, they were all very prominent and achieved great things, and so they tried to demonstrate things this way. But then the anti-eugenicists like Clarence Darrow, he was very opposed to the eugenics movement, thought it was just an abomination, injustice, that the involuntary sterilization of people was a crime and should be prohibited. But he also had a wry sense of humor, and he wasn't the only one. But he discovers Elizabeth Tuttle. He says, look at Elizabeth Tuttle. He says she's the paradigm of everything the eugenicists want to stop. And in fact, if she had lived, today, he said, she would have been sterilized, and none of those brilliant Edwardses would ever have been born. And so he uses Elizabeth Tuttle to try to demonstrate the irrationality of the eugenics movement, that you can't know who the descendants of an individual are going to become. You can't know whether a person who is poor or unmarried, that their children are going to be criminals. You can't know that. In fact, here we are with Elizabeth Tuttle, who, for all intents and purposes, was crazy and promiscuous. But look at her descendants. They were very prominent. We wouldn't have Jonathan Edwards and all of his glorious descendants, Clarence Darrow says, if it weren't for Elizabeth Tuttle. And so he uses it in the opposite way. And if you read his column or little essay on this, it's written in a very humorous fashion.
I can like a lot
of we interviewed the owners of the Clarence Darrow house, as we were telling you earlier, and that characterization that you presented is similar to how they present his characterization as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can find the document, and you can also read my book.
Absolutely.
These eugenicists, they just made these very easy connections. They had no real interest in the argument that a family like Jonathan and Sarah Edwards' family, which was a very prominent family and very well educated, and their children were very well educated, they might have been very successful in life because of all the benefits they had growing up, right?
Sure.
And then they, of course, raised their children in families that were very privileged, and that might explain why their children were very accomplished. They never asked those questions. They never looked at the context or the social forces that may have shaped families. They would look at a poor family and say, look at all the people who committed crimes in this family. But they never asked or looked and said, well, these were very poor people. And so, yeah, they probably did. They had no education. They probably did steal sometimes to get by, that sort of thing. And the eugenics movement, its major flaw was to say, here's one, and here's another one. So there has to be a genetic connection between them. Sure. And so here's Elizabeth Tuttle, here's Aaron Burr, here's Pierpont Edwards. We can just make this leap here and explain. I think both Aaron Burr and Pierpont Edwards had very traumatic starts to life, and I think some of their difficulties in their own lives might be better explained by their own traumas in their early lives as opposed to their genetic inheritance, right? But that's just a much more complicated explanation for their indiscretion, shall we say.
So at the end of the day, what do you think people should take away about Elizabeth Tuttle?
I think what I was talking about a little bit earlier is that when you read about people of the past, especially women, you just need to be careful in how you talk about people of the past. You don't make assumptions that about people of the past that maybe seem a little too convenient. Women's history is hard to do because women don't leave behind as many records as men. I mean, one reason Richard Everett's account of the divorce dominated the literature was because he wrote it down, right? And so he was able to control that narrative. And it's harder to uncover women's stories. And that's really what this book and this project was about, is how do we uncover the stories of women of the past, especially inarticulate women like Elizabeth Tuttle, who really didn't leave behind an account of her life. We assume she could write, but it's possible. I mean, most Puritan women could at least read, but they couldn't all write. And maybe she couldn't write. And so in that way, her voice was completely silent. So, how do we as historians think about this dilemma of studying women of the past? Most ordinary people of the past didn't leave, men or women, leave behind a lot of records. So are we just stuck with studying people who write a lot? I mean, they're the easiest people to study. There's the easiest historical figures to study. And they will always dominate historical narratives because there's where the robust records are. But, there's ways to try to tell stories of ordinary people of the past. And there are historical materials that allow us to maybe get a little closer to people like Elizabeth Tuttle. I don't know if I got the full picture. I'm sure I didn't. But I think I got a little closer to the story of their marriage than had been assumed by biographers. And in fact, one of the most prominent early 20th century biographers of Elizabeth Tuttle, of Jonathan Edwards, was kind of a fellow traveler in the eugenics movement. She was well versed in this eugenics literature. And so you can see how this very stereotypical bad girl image of Elizabeth Tuttle just creeps into academic biographical literature on Jonathan Edwards without any kind of real suspicion. And so that's really what I think the larger lesson is of this story. I mean, first of all, it's a ripping good yarn, I'll tell you that. but it's also from my perspective as a historian, an exercise in trying to address this challenge as a gender historian. How do we study ordinary women of the past?
Yeah.
How can we do them a little bit of justice?
It's like going back to, since we were talking about Aaron Burr, I think it's appropriate to bring up the Hamilton musical. But there's that line, like, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And what you leave behind is just so critical to understanding people, over time.
That's exactly right. And that line is one that resonated with me the many times I've listened to the musical. Yeah.
What projects are you currently working on? What research are you doing? Tell the people what you got going on.
Well, I'm working on a completely different sort of project. It's similar to some work I've done in the past, but on another project I did in the past, produce a volume of Jonathan Edwards' writings. And I'm working now on Cotton Mather, another very prominent early Puritan, very different from Jonathan Edwards. And I am editing a collection. He left behind a huge amount of writing. He even more so than Jonathan Edwards, which is voluminous. And the most important manuscript of Cotton Mather's that has never been published in its entirety is what is called his Biblia Americana, the American Bible. And he wrote this humongous multi-volume commentary on every book of the Bible. And it exists only in manuscript. It's part of the collection of the Mass Historical Society. But there is a consortium of historians and scholars who have been working together to transcribe and edit this huge Biblia Americana. And so far, 7 volumes out of 10 have been published. And I am working on what will be the 6th in the series of 10, which is his commentary from the Book of Lamentations in the Old Testament through the end of the prophets. and Lamentations through the end of the Hebrew Bible. And it's a very interesting project, and even more so in that, he's a whole another character that has, I think, been very misrepresented in history, and he is also very different from Jonathan Edwards, and who I've worked on all my academic life, and I am learning a great deal more about early America and the early New England Puritans by studying Cotton Mather and looking at his writings. And so that is what I am engaged in now.
Very cool.
Well, can you tell our listeners where they can find your book if they'd like to buy it?
Well, it is published by NYU Press, and it, of course, is on Amazon, like everything. Mm-hmm. You can also order it directly from New York University Press, either way. And I think it's fairly modestly priced. I'm not sure what exactly it's going for right now, but it's a reasonable price for a book.
From both of us, I'd like to say thank you very much.
I had a great time.
Our object highlight for this week are 2 chairs that we have in our collection at the Trumbull County Historical Society. They are black and red chairs. We will post a photo of them on the podcast website. And history tells us, our records tell us, that these 2 chairs came down from Connecticut with John Stark Edwards when he very first arrived in this area in 1799, and that they were given to him by his family, and that they were originally made by his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards. Now, I do want to say a caveat here that this is oral history, that this has been passed down through curators of the Historical Society, but we don't have formal documentation of this. However, if you look at these 2 chairs, they have the style and the date of making that accurate, and they are just extremely interesting when you think of what John Stark Edwards could have brought down here with him. He had very limited space in a wagon on a 6-week trek from Connecticut to Warren, and he would have only brought things with him that were either useful or very valuable or had some significance to him. And the fact that he decided to bring these 2 chairs here, I think, says a lot to what they meant to him and his family. I think that's all for this episode. Till next time.